Sometimes the most important encounters in life begin with the wrong assumption. Rain hammered against the glass entrance of a luxury hotel in downtown Boston as Sophie Miller stepped outside, clutching her coat tighter against the cold night air. The charity gala she had just attended had been overwhelming, filled with wealthy donors, polished speeches, and conversations that made her feel like she did not quite belong. As she stood under the dim streetlights scanning the curb, she checked her phone again. Her ride had been confirmed 10 minutes ago, yet no official car had arrived. A black SUV pulled up smoothly to the curb. The rear window lowered slightly, revealing a man in the driver's seat. He wore a simple dark coat, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, expression unreadable but attentive. Sophie hesitated for only a second before stepping closer. "Are you here for Sophie Miller?" she asked politely over the sound of rain. The man looked at her for a brief moment, then nodded. Yes. It was a single word, calm and unassuming. Sophie assumed he was a hired driver, likely sent by one of the event coordinators or perhaps arranged through the hotel service. Without hesitation, she opened the back door. "Thank you for coming out in this weather," she said as she settled inside, brushing raindrops from her sleeves. The man stepped out from the driver's side without responding immediately, walked around the vehicle, and opened the passenger door instead of returning to his seat. Sophie glanced at him, slightly confused, but assumed it was standard service protocol. He adjusted the seat, then returned to the driver's side and entered the vehicle again. "Long night?" he asked finally, his voice steady and quiet. Sophie exhaled, leaning back into the seat. "You could say that. These events are always a bit much for me." The man nodded as if he understood more than she realized. The SUV merged smoothly into the wet streets of Boston, city lights reflecting across the windshield in streaks of gold and white. Sophie glanced out the window, grateful for the warmth and silence. "I am Sophie, by the way," she said after a moment. "Most people call me Sophie Miller." There was a brief pause before the driver replied. "Ryan." No last name. No explanation. Just a name. Sophie did not question it. People working private transportation often kept things simple. As the car continued through the city, she found herself speaking more freely than she expected. She talked about her students, about the small public school where she taught, about how difficult it was to get proper funding for basic supplies. She even laughed once when describing how one student had mistaken her whiteboard markers for magic wands. Ryan listened without interruption. Not once did he check his phone. Not once did he seem distracted. When the conversation paused, he simply said, "You care about them a lot." Sophie smiled softly. "Of course I do. They deserve better than what they get." There was a brief silence after that, heavier than before. The SUV stopped at a red light, rain sliding down the windows in slow streams. Ryan looked forward, hands steady on the wheel. "People like you are rare," he said quietly. Sophie tilted her head slightly. "People like me?" Before he could answer, the light turned green and the car moved forward again. Sophie did not notice the way his fingers tightened briefly on the steering wheel. She did not notice the way his expression softened as he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. And she certainly did not know that the man she had just thanked for driving her home was not a driver at all, but a billionaire who had just decided not to correct her. The SUV finally turned onto a quiet residential street lined with small brick homes and bare maple trees glistening from the rain. Sophie pointed toward a modest two-story house with a porch light glowing warmly in the darkness. "That one," she said. Ryan pulled smoothly to the curb and shifted into park. For a moment, neither moved. The conversation that had begun as a simple ride home had somehow stretched across nearly 40 minutes. Sophie found herself reluctant to leave, which made very little sense considering she had only just met him. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Most people would not have listened to me talk that much." Ryan smiled faintly. "Most people probably would." Sophie laughed softly. "Trust me, they would not." She reached for the door handle, then paused. A cream-colored scarf slipped from her lap onto the floor. Neither noticed. "Well, good night, Ryan." "Good night, Sophie." Rain continued falling gently as she hurried toward the house. Ryan waited until she was safely inside before pulling away from the curb. Only then did he notice the scarf resting beside the back seat. He picked it up at the next stoplight. The fabric was soft, carrying the faint scent of rain and lavender. Attached to one end was a small stitched label with a handwritten name. "Sophie." Ryan stared at it for a second longer than necessary before placing it carefully on the passenger seat beside him. Across town, Sophie stepped into her house and immediately kicked off her shoes. Her older sister Emma looked up from the kitchen table. "You are late." Sophie dropped into a chair. The gala ran forever. Emma poured her a cup of tea. "Did you at least meet someone interesting?" Sophie thought about the quiet man behind the steering wheel. "Maybe." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Maybe." Sophie shrugged. "Just a driver." Yet, even as she said the words, something about them felt incomplete. The next morning, Ryan arrived at Callahan Development headquarters before 7 o'clock. The 60-story tower stood at the center of Boston's financial district and carried his name across the top floor. Executives immediately followed him into meetings. Financial reports waited on his desk. Investors expected decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. None of it held his attention for long. Several times throughout the morning, his eyes drifted toward the cream-colored scarf folded neatly beside his computer monitor. By lunchtime, his assistant finally noticed. "Is that new?" she asked. Ryan glanced at the scarf. "Someone left it behind. Are you planning to return it?" Ryan looked toward the city skyline outside his office window. "I think so." Meanwhile, Sophie arrived at Lincoln Elementary School carrying lesson plans and coffee. Her classroom immediately filled with noise, laughter, and endless questions from 24 energetic children. The familiar chaos normally made her happy. Today, however, she kept thinking about something unusual. She had forgotten her scarf. It was her favorite one, a gift from her grandmother. During recess, she searched her bag twice before finally accepting the obvious truth. It must still be in Ryan's SUV. She sighed. The chances of seeing him again were practically zero. She did not know his last name. She did not know which company he worked for. She barely knew anything about him at all. Yet later that afternoon, as students packed their backpacks and prepared to leave, a shadow appeared outside her classroom door. Sophie looked up. Standing in the hallway was Ryan, holding a familiar cream-colored scarf in his hands. For a second, both simply stared at each other. Then he smiled. "I think you left something in my car." For a moment, Sophie was too surprised to respond. The last person she expected to see standing outside her classroom was Ryan. Children hurried past him carrying backpacks and artwork while parents waited in the hallway. Yet somehow he looked completely comfortable amid the afternoon chaos. He held out the cream-colored scarf. "I figured this was important." Sophie immediately took it. "You drove all the way here just to return this?" Ryan shrugged lightly. "You said it was cold this time of year." Sophie laughed. "That is not exactly an answer. It is the answer I have." The smile that followed made her shake her head. Before she could say anything else, a small voice interrupted. "Miss Miller, is that your boyfriend?" Sophie nearly dropped the scarf. A second grader named Tommy stood nearby grinning mischievously. Several other students instantly stopped to listen. "Tommy," Sophie said, trying not to laugh, "he is not my boyfriend." Ryan remained completely serious. "That seems like useful information." The children burst into laughter. Sophie covered her face with one hand. By the time the last student finally left, she found herself smiling more than she had all week. "I am sorry about that," she said. Ryan glanced toward the empty hallway. "For what?" "The interrogation. I have attended shareholder meetings." His expression remained perfectly calm. The children were more intimidating. Sophie laughed again. The sound surprised both of them. Ryan checked his watch. He should have been attending a development meeting downtown. Instead, he was standing in an elementary school hallway discussing second graders and scarves. Strangely, he preferred this. "Would you like some coffee?" Sophie asked suddenly. "As a thank you." Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I think I would." 20 minutes later, they sat inside a small cafe across the street from the school. The place was simple. Wooden tables. Local artwork. The smell of fresh pastries filling the air. Sophie immediately relaxed. This was her world. Not charity galas and luxury hotels. Ryan watched her greet the staff by name. He noticed how people smiled when she entered. He noticed how she asked about a waitress's recovering father. Most importantly, he noticed she treated everyone exactly the same. The conversation flowed naturally. Sophie talked about her students. Ryan listened. Ryan asked questions. Sophie answered. At one point, she pulled a small notebook from her bag. Colorful drawings covered the pages. "What is that?" Ryan asked. "My treasure collection." He raised an eyebrow. Sophie opened the notebook and revealed dozens of notes written by students over the years. crayon drawings, thank you messages, handwritten cards. Ryan slowly turned the pages. You kept all of these? Every single one. Her voice softened. Some people collect expensive things. I collect reminders. Ryan felt something shift inside him. In his world, success was measured by towers built, investments completed, and numbers displayed on financial reports. Yet the notebook in Sophie's hand somehow felt more valuable than anything sitting in his office. As they continued talking, Sophie accidentally left the notebook on the table while stepping away to answer a phone call from her sister. Ryan glanced down at it. One page had fallen open. At the top, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were the words, "Miss Miller never gives up on anyone." Ryan stared at the sentence for a long moment. When Sophie returned, he closed the notebook carefully and handed it back. Neither noticed the thoughtful expression lingering on his face. Because at that moment, Ryan Callahan was beginning to realize that the woman who thought he was a driver possessed something far rarer than wealth. She possessed the kind of character money could never buy. Over the next 2 weeks, an unexpected routine quietly formed between them. Ryan would occasionally stop by the school after classes ended, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes simply asking how the day had gone. Sophie never questioned why a driver seemed to have such flexible hours. Ryan never offered an explanation. The more time they spent together, the easier everything became. One chilly Thursday afternoon, Sophie found him waiting outside the school entrance, leaning casually against the black SUV. The moment she stepped outside, she noticed something unusual. He looked distracted. Bad day? She asked. Ryan smiled faintly. What makes you think that? Sophie pointed toward the untouched coffee cup in his hand. You have been holding that for at least 10 minutes. Ryan laughed. You pay attention to details. It is part of the job. They began walking toward a nearby park. The trees were nearly bare now, and a cold wind carried fallen leaves across the path. Sophie spoke about a fundraising problem at the school. Budget cuts had forced administrators to postpone plans for a small reading center that students desperately needed. It is frustrating, she admitted. The children deserve better. Ryan listened carefully. How much would it cost? Sophie immediately shook her head. More than we can raise. How much? She named the number. Ryan remained silent. To him, it was a tiny amount compared to the figures discussed daily in corporate boardrooms. Yet he could hear genuine disappointment in her voice. I am sure something will work out, he said. Sophie smiled. You always say that. Because it usually does. They continued walking until they reached a small food cart near the park entrance. Sophie bought 2 hot chocolates before Ryan could object. My turn, she insisted. You return my scarf. As they stood nearby sipping their drinks, an elderly man accidentally dropped several grocery bags while crossing the sidewalk. Before anyone else reacted, Sophie immediately hurried over. Apples rolled across the pavement. A loaf of bread landed near the curb. Ryan watched as she helped gather everything without hesitation. She spoke to the man kindly, carried the heavier bags to his car, and refused the $20 bill he tried to offer in thanks. When she finally returned, her cheeks were pink from the cold. You did not have to do that, Ryan said. Sophie looked genuinely confused. Of course I did. The answer stayed with him long after the conversation ended. That evening, Ryan attended a private meeting on the top floor of Callahan Development headquarters. Around the conference table sat investors, attorneys, and senior executives. They discussed land acquisitions, commercial projects, and future developments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Then one presentation appeared on the screen. A proposed redevelopment plan involving several city blocks near Lincoln Elementary School. Ryan immediately recognized the location. The project would generate enormous profits. It would also place significant pressure on surrounding community programs. What is the timeline? Ryan asked. An executive explained the details. As the discussion continued, Ryan found himself thinking not about financial projections, but about Sophie describing her students. About the notebook filled with handwritten messages. About the reading center that might never exist. When the meeting finally ended, everyone expected approval. Instead, Ryan stood and closed the presentation folder. We are postponing this review. Confused looks spread around the room. Sir, one executive asked. Ryan's expression remained calm. There are additional community considerations that need evaluation. Nobody argued. When the room emptied, Ryan remained alone beside the windows overlooking Boston. Far below, City lights stretched toward the horizon. For the first time in years, a business decision had been influenced by something other than profit. And the woman responsible still believed he was simply the man who drove her home on a rainy night. The following Monday began like any other day at Lincoln Elementary. Children rushed through the hallways carrying backpacks almost larger than themselves. Teachers balanced stacks of papers and coffee cups. Sophie expected an ordinary week. Instead, by noon, everything changed. She was sitting in the teacher's lounge when the principal suddenly entered carrying an email printout. "You are not going to believe this," he said. Every teacher immediately looked up. "Believe what?" Sophie asked. The principal placed the paper on the table. An anonymous donor just funded the entire Reading Center project. Silence filled the room. Then came excited questions from every direction. Anonymous. Who? How much? The principal shook his head. The donor specifically requested privacy. Sophie stared at the paper. The amount was exactly what the school needed. Not $1 more. Not $1 less. The room erupted into celebration. Teachers hugged each other. Some actually cried. For years they had struggled to provide enough resources for students. Now everything could finally move forward. Yet amid the excitement, Sophie found herself thinking about a conversation in the park only a few days earlier. Ryan had asked how much funding was needed. The memory lingered in the back of her mind. By late afternoon, she convinced herself it was a coincidence. After all, Ryan was a driver. Even if he wanted to help, no ordinary driver could simply write a check that size. Still, the timing felt strange. That evening, Ryan arrived outside the school as usual. Sophie immediately walked toward the SUV carrying more energy than he had ever seen. "You look happy," he said. "The Reading Center got funded." Ryan smiled. "That is wonderful news." Sophie studied him carefully. "You do not seem surprised." "Should I be?" She narrowed her eyes playfully. "You are hiding something." Ryan looked genuinely innocent. "That sounds serious." Sophie laughed despite herself. They drove to a small diner near the harbor where they often talked after work. As they sat in a booth by the window, Sophie described the school's plans. New books, reading programs, updated learning spaces. Every time she mentioned the students, her face lit up. Ryan found himself paying more attention to her excitement than the actual details. "You really love your job," he said. Sophie nodded immediately. "Most days." "Only most." She smiled. "There are difficult days. But then a child learns something new or gains confidence or finally believes in themselves." Her expression softened. "That makes everything worth it." Ryan looked down briefly. In his world, success was measured by quarterly reports and stock performance. Listening to Sophie always reminded him that there were other ways to define a meaningful life. As they left the diner later that evening, a cold wind swept through the streets. Sophie wrapped the cream-colored scarf around her neck. "I still cannot believe someone helped the school," she said quietly. "Maybe there are more good people in the world than we realize," Ryan replied. Sophie smiled. "Maybe." Neither noticed a black luxury sedan parked across the street. Inside sat one of Ryan's senior executives. The man stared through the windshield in complete disbelief. He had spent the afternoon trying to reach the billionaire CEO regarding urgent business matters. Instead, he had accidentally discovered Ryan sharing milkshakes and conversation with a schoolteacher who clearly had no idea who he really was. The executive slowly lowered his phone. For the first time, Ryan's carefully guarded secret was no longer known by only one person. And somewhere deep down, Ryan realized that the longer he waited to tell Sophie the truth, the more difficult that truth would become. The following week brought the first real complication to Ryan's carefully hidden double life. Early Tuesday morning, he was finishing a meeting with senior executives when the same executive who had spotted him outside the diner quietly remained behind after everyone else left. The conference room doors closed. Silence settled over the enormous space. "Is there something else?" Ryan asked. The executive adjusted his tie awkwardly. "I saw you last week." Ryan already knew what was coming. "Saw me where?" "At the diner, near the harbor." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "And?" The executive hesitated. "The woman you were with did not seem to know who you are." Ryan's expression remained calm. "That is because she does not." The executive blinked several times. "Sir, with all due respect, every newspaper in Boston knows who you are." "She does not read business newspapers." The answer somehow made perfect sense and no sense at all. After a moment, Ryan stood. This conversation stays here. Of course. Yet as the executive left, Ryan realized something troubling. The secret was becoming harder to protect. Later that afternoon, Sophie was helping students prepare decorations for a school literacy event when she received a message from Ryan asking if she had time for coffee after work. Her smile appeared immediately. She typed back before she could overthink it. Yes. At 6 o'clock they met at their usual cafe. Snow flurries drifted lightly through the air outside, while warm lights glowed inside. Sophie noticed Ryan seemed distracted again. "You were thinking about something," she said. Ryan laughed softly. "Am I that obvious?" "To me?" "A little." The answer surprised both of them. Ryan studied her for a second. There was no judgment in her voice. No expectation. Just genuine concern. "Work," he admitted. Technically it was true. Sophie nodded knowingly. "Bad boss." Ryan nearly choked on his coffee. "Something like that." She grinned. "You should tell him to relax." "I will consider it." Their laughter drew curious glances from nearby customers. Neither seemed to notice. The evening passed quickly. Too quickly. As they walked outside afterward, they found fresh snow beginning to cover the sidewalks. The city looked softer somehow. Quieter. Sophie pulled her cream-colored scarf tighter around her neck. "You know," she said, "when I first got into your car, I thought you were probably tired of listening to strangers complain all day." Ryan looked at her. "And now I think you are a really good friend." The words hit him harder than expected. Friend. For a moment, he simply stood there listening to the distant sounds of traffic. In business, people called him powerful, successful, influential. Very few people ever called him a friend. "That means a lot," he said quietly. Sophie smiled. "Good. It was supposed to." The next morning, excitement swept through Lincoln Elementary. Construction preparations for the new reading center had officially begun. Teachers celebrated. Students asked endless questions. During lunch, the principal entered Sophie's classroom carrying several documents. "You should see this." Sophie looked up. "What is it?" The anonymous donor approved additional funding. Her eyes widened. Additional books, furniture, technology upgrades. The principal shook his head in amazement. Whoever this person is, they really care. Sophie smiled. She genuinely believed that. What she did not know was that at that exact moment, Ryan was sitting in a boardroom refusing to let anyone reduce a single dollar from the school's budget request. And with every decision he made, the line between his hidden world and Sophie's world grew thinner. Eventually, those worlds would collide. The only question was whether their growing friendship would survive the truth when it finally arrived. December arrived with icy mornings and festive decorations appearing throughout Boston. At Lincoln Elementary, excitement filled every hallway as students prepared for the annual Winter Literacy Fair. The new reading center was nearly finished, and anticipation grew with each passing day. Sophie spent long hours helping organize activities, book displays, and student presentations. One afternoon, while arranging decorations inside the partially completed reading center, she received unexpected news from the principal. "The anonymous donor will be sending representatives to inspect the project next week," he explained. "We want everything perfect." Sophie smiled. "The children are already treating this place like a castle." The principal laughed. "Then let us make sure it feels like one." Later that evening, Sophie met Ryan near the harbor for their usual walk. The cold air carried the scent of snow, and holiday lights reflected beautifully across the water. As they strolled along the promenade, Sophie spoke enthusiastically about the reading center. "You should see it now," she said. "The students are counting down the days until it opens." Ryan listened carefully. "You sound proud." "I am." She looked out across the harbor. Someone changed a lot of lives without asking for recognition. Ryan felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and guilt. The secret was becoming heavier. Every time Sophie praised the anonymous donor, he found himself wanting to tell her the truth. Yet every time he imagined her reaction, he hesitated. Their friendship had become too important to risk. As they continued walking, they noticed a small crowd gathering nearby. An elderly street musician was struggling to carry several equipment cases across an icy section of sidewalk. Without hesitation, Ryan stepped forward. He helped move the equipment, secured the musician's stand, and even adjusted a loose wheel on one of the cases. Sophie watched quietly. The musician thanked him repeatedly. Ryan simply smiled and wished him a good evening. Once they resumed walking, Sophie looked at him thoughtfully. You do that a lot. Ryan glanced at her. Do what? Help people when nobody is watching. Ryan shrugged. Most people would. Sophie slowly shook her head. No. Most people tell themselves someone else will do it. Her words stayed with him. What neither of them noticed was a photographer from a local business magazine standing across the street. The man recognized Ryan immediately. Several photographs were taken before Ryan disappeared into the evening crowd. 2 days later, a problem emerged. During a board meeting at Callahan Development, Ryan learned that a powerful investment group intended to revive plans for a commercial project near Lincoln Elementary. The proposal would place enormous pressure on the surrounding neighborhood and threaten several community programs. The returns would be significant, one executive explained. Ryan stared at the presentation. He no longer saw numbers. He saw students reading books inside the news center. He saw Sophie talking about giving children opportunities. No, he said firmly. The room fell silent. Sir, we are not moving forward. Several executives exchanged confused looks. One investor attempted to argue. Ryan remained calm. The decision is final. After the meeting ended, he stood alone inside his office overlooking the city. For years, business decisions had always come first. Now something else mattered more. Meanwhile, across town, Sophie was hanging student artwork inside the reading center when she discovered a folded piece of paper tucked inside her notebook. One of her students had left a handwritten note. The message was simple. Thank you for believing in us. Sophie smiled and carefully placed the note inside her treasured collection. She had no idea that somewhere else in Boston, a man who was falling deeper in love with her was quietly protecting the future she cared about most. The week of the Winter Literacy Fair finally arrived, and excitement spread through Lincoln Elementary like electricity. Students rehearsed presentations. Teachers rushed between classrooms carrying decorations and stacks of books. The new reading center stood finished at last, filled with bright shelves, comfortable chairs, and hundreds of new titles waiting to be discovered. Sophie could hardly believe it was real. On the morning of the event, she arrived before sunrise. Snow covered the playground in a thin white blanket, and holiday lights still glowed softly along the school entrance. As she unlocked her classroom, she noticed a familiar vehicle parked across the street. Ryan sat inside the SUV holding a coffee cup. Sophie smiled immediately. A few moments later, he handed her a warm drink through the passenger window. Big day, he said. The biggest. Ryan looked toward the school. You helped make this happen. Sophie shook her head. The anonymous donor made it happen. Ryan said nothing. By afternoon, the school was packed with families, community leaders, and local media. Children proudly guided visitors through the new reading center. Everywhere Sophie looked, she saw smiles. For the first time in years, Lincoln Elementary felt fully supported. Then something unexpected happened. A black luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot. Several sharply dressed executives stepped out carrying presentation materials. Sophie recognized none of them. The principal immediately went to greet the group. His expression changed the moment they began speaking. Minutes later, he hurried towards Sophie looking concerned. There is a problem. Her smile disappeared. What kind of problem? Representatives from a development consortium are here. Sophie frowned. Why? They claim there are renewed discussions about acquiring nearby properties. The words hit her like cold water. The neighborhood surrounding the school had always been vulnerable to commercial redevelopment. If enough land changed ownership, community programs could disappear. Families could be displaced. The reading center might survive, but the people it served could suffer. Throughout the afternoon, anxiety spread among staff members. Rumors moved quickly. Parents began asking questions. Several community leaders looked visibly worried. Sophie tried to stay focused on the students, but concern lingered in the back of her mind. Later, she found Ryan standing quietly near one of the displays, observing the event. I thought you were working today, she said. I am. The answer confused her. Before she could ask more, the principal called everyone together for a brief announcement. Representatives from the development consortium stepped forward. One executive began outlining possible future plans for the area. The room grew noticeably quieter. Then another voice interrupted. Those plans will not be moving forward. Every head turned. A tall man in an expensive suit had just entered the room. Sophie recognized him immediately. He was one of the executives she had seen arriving earlier. The man approached the microphone calmly. After further review, the proposal has been withdrawn. Relief swept across the room. Applause followed. Parents smiled. Teachers exchanged grateful looks. Sophie exhaled for what felt like the first time all afternoon. Amid the celebration, however, she noticed something strange. The executive who had spoken was looking directly toward Ryan. Not casually, respectfully, almost nervously. Their eyes met briefly. The executive gave a subtle nod before stepping away. Sophie frowned. Do you know him? Ryan's expression remained neutral. A little. It was not technically a lie. Yet for the first time, Sophie sensed there was something she did not understand. Something important. As the event continued, she found herself watching Ryan differently. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. Because the man she thought she knew seemed to move through certain situations with an authority that did not quite match the life he had described. And somewhere deep inside, a small question had finally begun to form. The question stayed with Sophie long after the literacy fair ended. She tried to dismiss it. Everyone knew someone important. Everyone occasionally crossed paths with executives and business leaders. Yet the image kept replaying in her mind. The way that executive had looked at Ryan, the respect in his voice, the immediate withdrawal of a major development proposal. None of it fit neatly with the story she believed. A few days later, Sophie was grading papers in her classroom when Emma stopped by after work. Her sister immediately noticed her distracted expression. You are thinking about him again. Sophie looked up. That obvious? Emma laughed. You have mentioned him at least 5 times in 20 minutes. Sophie smiled despite herself. Maybe. Emma sat down across from her. So when are you going to admit you like him? The question caught Sophie completely off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. We are friends. Emma folded her arms. That was not an answer. Sophie looked down at the student papers scattered across her desk. Somewhere along the way, Ryan had become the first person she wanted to call when something good happened. The first person she looked for after a difficult day. The first person who seemed to genuinely listen without expecting anything in return. That realization felt both comforting and terrifying. Later that evening, she met Ryan at a small bookstore cafe they had recently discovered. Snow drifted softly outside while customers browsed shelves lined with novels and biographies. Ryan was already there when she arrived. You are early, she said. You are late. She laughed. By 3 minutes. I noticed. They spent nearly 2 hours talking. Books, childhood memories, travel dreams. At one point, Sophie admitted she had never visited Europe. Ryan promised she would love it. You sound very confident. I have been there a few times. Sophie smiled. That seems expensive for a driver. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ryan nearly laughed. Maybe I save aggressively. Sophie narrowed her eyes. You are impossible. Yet the moment passed quickly. Neither wanted to ruin the evening. As they prepared to leave, Sophie noticed a magazine sitting near the checkout counter. A business publication. The cover featured an article about Boston's most influential executives. She barely glanced at it before looking away. Business magazines had never interested her. Ryan, however, noticed it immediately. His photograph occupied nearly half the cover. Fortunately, it was partially hidden behind another magazine. He calmly shifted his position to block the view. Ready? He asked. Sophie nodded. Outside, snowflakes continued falling beneath glowing streetlights. As they walked toward the SUV, Sophie slipped slightly on an icy patch. Instantly, Ryan reached out and steadied her. For a brief second, neither moved. His hand remained lightly on her arm. Their eyes met. The world seemed unusually quiet. Then Sophie smiled. Thank you. Ryan slowly released her. Anytime. The drive home felt different. Not uncomfortable. Just filled with things neither knew how to say. Meanwhile, across town, the photographer who had captured Ryan helping the elderly street musician was finalizing an upcoming feature article. The magazine cover displayed a large photograph of Ryan Callahan beneath a bold headline celebrating Boston's Billionaire Philanthropist of the Year. Publication was scheduled for the following week. Neither Ryan nor Sophie knew it yet, but the carefully protected secret that had brought them together was rapidly approaching the moment it could no longer remain hidden. The reveal arrived on an ordinary Wednesday morning. There were no dramatic warnings, no mysterious phone calls, no signs that Sophie's world was about to change completely. The day began with lesson plans, attendance sheets, and students excited about an upcoming winter break. During lunch, she stopped at The teachers lounge carrying a sandwich and a stack of papers. Several teachers were gathered around a magazine someone had left on the table. "Can you believe this?" one teacher asked. "Who?" another replied. "The guy on the cover. Apparently, he donated millions to education programs this year." Sophie barely paid attention as she sat down. Then the magazine was turned toward her. The moment her eyes landed on the cover, everything stopped. Her heart seemed to forget how to beat. The photograph was unmistakable. The same calm blue eyes. The same familiar smile. The same face she had seen dozens of times sitting behind the wheel of a black SUV. Except beneath the photograph appeared a headline. Ryan Callahan, Boston's Billionaire Philanthropist of the Year. Sophie stared at the page. One of the teachers continued talking. "He owns half the city, apparently." Another laughed. "Not literally." Sophie heard none of it. Her hands had gone completely still. Slowly, she picked up the magazine. The article stretched across several pages. Ryan Callahan, founder and chief executive officer of Callahan Development. Real estate billionaire. Major donor. National business leader. Photographs showed him speaking at conferences, standing beside government officials, attending charity events. Every image felt impossible. Yet there he was. The man she knew. The man she trusted. The man she thought was a driver. By the time school ended, Sophie had read the article 3 times. Each reading made things worse. Memories replayed themselves through an entirely different lens. The anonymous donor. The executives. The development project. The confidence. The resources. Suddenly, every unexplained detail made sense. And with each realization came a painful question. How much of it had been real? That evening, Ryan arrived outside the school exactly as he always did. He stepped out of the SUV carrying 2 coffees. The moment he saw Sophie's face, he knew. She stood near the entrance holding the magazine tightly against her side. "Sophie." He never finished the sentence. She held up the magazine. "How long?" Ryan closed his eyes briefly. "I wanted to tell you." "That is not what I asked." Her voice was not angry. Somehow that hurt more. "How long?" Ryan looked directly at her. "Since the beginning." The words hung heavily between them. Sophie nodded slowly. "The entire time." "Yes." A painful silence followed. Students and parents passed nearby, unaware of the conversation unfolding only a few feet away. "So every conversation," Sophie began. "Every coffee. Every walk. Every time I talked about my problems," Ryan stepped forward. "Those were real." "Were they?" Her eyes filled with disappointment. "Because I thought I knew you." Ryan had negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced hostile investors, managed corporate crises. Nothing had ever felt as difficult as standing there watching trust disappear from Sophie's eyes. "I never lied about how I felt," he said quietly. "You let me believe something that was not true." He had no defense against that, because she was right. Sophie looked down at the magazine one final time. Then she handed it back to him. "I need some time." Ryan's chest tightened. "Sophie," she shook her head gently. "Please." For several seconds, neither moved. Then Sophie turned and walked away. Ryan remained standing outside the school long after she disappeared from sight. Snow began falling softly around him. The coffee cups grew cold in his hands. And for the first time since the night she climbed into his vehicle, he realized that revealing the truth had cost him the one thing he had never intended to lose. The days that followed felt unusually long for both of them. Sophie threw herself into work, arriving early and leaving late. She focused on lesson plans, student projects, and preparing for the new semester. Whenever thoughts of Ryan surfaced, she pushed them away. Yet avoiding him proved far more difficult than she expected. Every hallway in the reading center reminded her of conversations they had shared. Every new book on the shelves reminded her that someone had quietly changed hundreds of lives without asking for recognition. The problem was not discovering that Ryan was wealthy. The problem was discovering that he had hidden such an enormous part of himself. Meanwhile, Ryan respected her request for space. He did not call. He did not visit the school. He did not appear outside her classroom with coffee. For the first time in months, their routines disappeared completely. Yet his absence somehow felt louder than his presence had ever been. One afternoon, Sophie stayed late organizing materials inside the reading center. As she sorted books onto a shelf, the principal entered carrying several folders. "I almost forgot," he said. "The donor dedication ceremony is next week." Sophie looked up. "The anonymous donor?" The principal smiled awkwardly. "Not anonymous anymore." Sophie already knew the answer before he continued. Mr. Callahan will be attending personally. Her stomach tightened. After the principal left, she stared silently at the rows of books surrounding her. Part of her wanted to avoid the event entirely. Another part knew she could not. The reading center existed because of Ryan. The students deserved to celebrate what had been accomplished. A week later, the dedication ceremony arrived. Families, teachers, community leaders, and local reporters filled the school auditorium. Sophie sat near the back, beside Emma. "You look nervous," her sister whispered. Sophie kept her eyes on the stage. "I am not nervous." Emma smiled knowingly. "Right." Moments later, the event began. Several speakers thanked volunteers and staff. Students shared stories about their favorite books. Applause filled the room repeatedly. Then the principal stepped forward once more. "There is one person we would especially like to recognize today." The audience immediately understood. Ryan walked onto the stage. Sophie had seen him countless times before, yet somehow this felt different. He wore a tailored navy suit. The room treated him with obvious respect. Reporters raised cameras. Community leaders greeted him warmly. This was the world he had hidden from her. Ryan accepted the applause graciously before approaching the podium. For several seconds, he simply looked out across the audience. Then his gaze found Sophie. "People often assume generosity begins with money," he said. "In my experience, it begins with example." The room grew quiet. "Several months ago, I met someone who reminded me that success is not measured by what we accumulate. It is measured by what we give." Sophie's heart began beating faster. Ryan continued. "I saw a teacher who believed in children when others overlooked them. I saw someone who treated every person with kindness regardless of status or position. That example changed the way I looked at many things." The audience listened attentively. Sophie could not look away. "This reading center exists because an entire community refused to stop caring," Ryan said. "I was simply fortunate enough to help." Applause erupted again. Yet as everyone around her celebrated, Sophie found herself seeing something she had been too hurt to recognize before. Ryan had never used his wealth to impress her. He had used it to protect what mattered to her. And for the first time since learning the truth, the wall she had built around her heart began to crack. After the ceremony ended, people gathered throughout the reading center celebrating the achievement they had worked so hard to create. Students showed parents their favorite books. Teachers posed for photographs. Reporters interviewed community leaders. Through it all, Sophie remained unusually quiet. Ryan's words echoed in her mind. For weeks, she had focused on the secret he kept. She had spent far less time thinking about everything he had actually done. Eventually, she slipped away from the crowd and entered one of the quieter sections of the reading center. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating rows of books that had not existed a few months earlier. She ran her fingers along a shelf and remembered every obstacle they had faced. The funding shortages, the canceled plans, the uncertainty. Then she remembered who had stepped in every single time. A few minutes later, Emma found her standing alone. "There you are," her sister said. Sophie smiled faintly. "I needed a minute." Emma studied her carefully. "You still love him?" Sophie looked away. "It is not that simple." "No," Emma agreed. "It never is." They stood quietly for a moment. Then Emma spoke again. "Did he hurt you because he is wealthy?" Sophie immediately shook her head. "No." "Did he hurt you because he treated you badly?" "No." "Did he ever make you feel small?" "Never." Emma folded her arms. "Then maybe the question is not whether he made a mistake. Maybe the question is why he made it." After Emma left, Sophie remained alone with that thought. Later that evening, she returned home carrying a box of student projects that needed organizing. As she unpacked the materials onto her dining table, something slipped from between several folders. It was the small notebook she always carried. Curious, she opened it. A folded piece of paper fell into her lap. Sophie immediately recognized it. It was the parking pass from the night of the charity gala. The one she had absent-mindedly saved because it happened to be tucked inside her notebook. Smiling softly, she turned it over. Then she froze. Written across the back, in Ryan's handwriting, was a short message she had never noticed before. It must have been placed there months ago. The words were simple. "Thank you for treating me like a person before you knew who I was." Sophie stared at the sentence. Suddenly dozens of memories returned all at once. Ryan helping strangers when nobody was watching. Ryan listening to stories about her students. Ryan quietly protecting the school. Ryan sitting in a cafe discussing children's drawings instead of business deals. None of those moments had required him to pretend. None of them had benefited him. They had simply been real. For the first time since discovering the truth, Sophie allowed herself to acknowledge something she had been avoiding. The man she cared about had never disappeared. The billionaire was real. The driver was real. The friend was real. They had always been the same person. Across the city that same evening, Ryan stood alone inside his office overlooking Boston Harbor. Snow drifted past the windows as he picked up the cream-colored scarf that still rested in a drawer beside his desk. He remembered the rainy night they met. He remembered the laughter, the conversations, the growing trust. Most of all, he remembered the look in Sophie's eyes before everything changed. For the first time in weeks, however, his phone suddenly lit up with a new message. He looked down and saw a name he had not expected to see. Sophie. His heart immediately began racing as he opened the message. It contained only 7 words. Can we talk tomorrow after school? The next afternoon arrived with a strange quietness across Lincoln Elementary. Sophie spent the morning teaching as usual, but her mind was elsewhere. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing at the clock, wondering whether she had made a mistake sending the message. Can we talk tomorrow after school? The simplicity of those 7 words now felt heavier than anything she had written before. When the final bell rang, students rushed out into the hallway, their voices echoing through the building. Sophie stayed behind, organizing papers with slower movements than usual. She told herself she was just finishing work. In reality, she was waiting. Outside, a familiar SUV was already parked across the street. Ryan had arrived early and had not moved from the same spot for over 20 minutes. He sat quietly, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the school entrance. For once, he was not thinking about meetings, investments, or business decisions. He was thinking about what he might lose. When Sophie finally stepped outside, she immediately noticed him. She hesitated for only a second before walking toward the vehicle. Ryan stepped out as she approached, but neither of them smiled. The usual ease between them was gone, replaced by something more fragile. You came, he said. Sophie nodded. I asked you to. A pause followed. The wind moved softly through the empty street. Do you want to walk? Ryan asked gently. She agreed. They walked side by side without speaking for several blocks, eventually reaching a quiet section of the river path. The water reflected the pale afternoon sky, and the city noise faded behind them. Sophie finally stopped walking. Ryan stopped beside her. I read something, she said quietly. He already knew what she meant. The note, he replied. Sophie nodded. And the parking pass. Ryan looked toward the water. I did not plan for you to find that. I know. Another silence settled between them. Sophie took a breath. I do not know how to separate everything anymore. Ryan turned slightly toward her. You do not have to separate it. Yes, I do, she said, voice steady but emotional. Because I need to understand who you really are. Ryan did not interrupt. For once, there was no carefully chosen explanation. No corporate language. No hidden version of himself. I am the same person, he said quietly. The same person who sat in your car that night. The same person who returned your scarf. The same person who helped your school. Sophie looked down. But you were not honest with me. Ryan nodded once. I was not. The honesty in his answer made the moment even heavier. Sophie turned slightly away, struggling to process everything. When I thought you were a driver, I trusted you without thinking, she said. When I learned the truth, I started questioning everything. Ryan listened carefully. And now? Sophie hesitated. The wind moved gently across the river, carrying the sound of distant traffic. Now I do not know what scares me more, she admitted. The fact that you are a billionaire, or the fact that you are still the same person I cared about before I knew that. Ryan felt something shift in his chest. Hope, fragile but real. Sophie, he said softly. She finally looked at him. I never wanted you to see me as my wealth, he continued. I only wanted you to know me. Her eyes searched his face, trying to find certainty in something that had felt uncertain for so long. Then why hide it? She asked. Ryan paused. This time there was no perfect answer. Only truth. Because I was afraid, he said. Not of losing my reputation. Of losing you. The words hung in the air between them. Sophie did not respond immediately. Instead, she slowly stepped closer to the river's edge, watching the water move beneath the fading light. Ryan stayed where he was, giving her space. For the first time since everything had changed, there was no mask between them. Only two people standing in the quiet, facing the reality of everything they had built and everything they might still lose. And in that silence, Sophie finally realized that the hardest part was not discovering who Ryan was. It was deciding whether she was willing to trust him again now that she knew